Good morning, everyone. My name is Jim Beddix. I'm the Director of Server Storage Engineering here at IntegraONE. I want to thank you for joining us this morning for our quick webinar on Veeam Availability Suite 9.5 Update 4. Joining me today as a co-presenter is also Eric Doherty from Veeam. So Eric, you want to take a minute to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning. As Jim said, Eric Doherty. My role, I work closely with the folks at IntegraONE in helping them to evangelize, learn more about, and teach more about the products that Veeam offers for backup and recovery and data management.
Great. Thanks, Eric. So without any further ado, we're going to bring up the first slide, but I do want to go over a little bit of housekeeping while you're taking a look at this. So we're going to present today for about 20 to 25 minutes. Along the way, if you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the question box, type them in there. We'll do our best to answer them. We'll try to keep some time at the end for some Q&A as well. If for any reason, though, we don't get to answer your question during the webinar today, we will reach out to you directly via email with an answer. Also, at the end of the presentation today, shortly afterwards, you should get a survey for some feedback. As long as you're not subject to E-rate rules, by submitting that survey, you will also be eligible for a Starbucks gift card. Unfortunately, for those that are under the E-rate rules, we can't provide you with the gift card, but we would still love the feedback on the session. It helps us to improve going forward. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So on the screen, you'll see a very large list of new features or improved features that came along with Veeam 9.5 Update 4, which has been released for a little over a month now. On the list there, a bunch of the topics we are going to try and cover today, but obviously due to time constraints, we won't be able to deep dive into all of them, and there's a couple that we won't actually touch upon really at all. But again, if you do have questions or there's a topic that you see here that we don't get to or that we don't get in depth that you're asking for, go ahead and send that question in and we'll follow up with you. Right. Along with the new feature support, there are some additional platforms that are now supported by Update 4. The biggest ones right here, I think, is the first line. So up until Update 4, we didn't have official support for VMware 6.7 or 6.5 Update 2. With Update 4 being published, we now have support for those platforms, meaning you can get onto the latest and greatest versions from VMware. Along with that, there was added support for VMware Cloud on AWS. And if you're a NetApp storage customer and you have NetApp SolidFire, there's a universal API plugin to support that from a storage perspective. The first section that we'll get into today is some of the improvements on the Veeam Explorers. Most of you, if you are Veeam customers, familiar with the term Veeam Explorer. That's where you're going to go in to do the work for your restores, whether that's Exchange, SQL, Active Directory. Those are your views into the backups to do the work on that data. So you'll see some improvements were made pretty much across the board. We're just going to highlight some of the higher end changes here. So the first one is large LUN support. So if you had VMs now that are on LUNs larger than 16 terabytes, the Veeam Explorer for storage snapshots can now address that. Also, you'll see for Active Directory, there was some significant performance improvements and support for doing restore of Microsoft system objects. When it comes to the Veeam Explorers, for most of the other products that are out there, what you'll notice on all of these is that there's now full PowerShell support. So while we've got some additional features and functions unique to each Explorer itself, the big takeaway here is now you can script or command line access those Veeam Explorers via PowerShell. So that's been added to both, in this particular slide, Veeam Explorer for Exchange and for SharePoint, as well as Veeam Explorer for SQL. Additionally, there's a number of features here that were added for Veeam Explorer for SQL, some additional restore options, and the ability to export your database into a native SQL backup format. That's usually a big one if you've got some dedicated DBAs on-prem. They like to work with importing or exporting backups in the native format, so that's a big win for those guys. Veeam Explorer for Oracle, if there's any Oracle customers out there, one of the big functionality adds here is support for Data Guard. It was something that was missing before. We also have the ability to restore now from a Veeam RMAN plugin, which we could talk about. We're going to address that a little bit later in the presentation today. And again, full PowerShell capability here as well. One of the larger features I think that everyone was waiting for that came out in Update 4 is support for object storage. So this is a big add-on to the product, something that we've been waiting for a while, and pleased to announce that it's here in Update 4. So what challenge does object storage address? So obviously we've got data growth in the environment today. Your data sets keep getting larger and larger. Your backup sets therefore get larger and larger. Along with that, you've got compliance requirements for long-time storage of those backups. It's really not affordable to keep those on primary or even some secondary backup options. Or if it is affordable, it becomes complicated. Think of things like tape out, where you're constantly dealing with storing tapes or manipulating tape data. There's got to be a better way to deal with that. Object storage is the way to deal with that. It's large capacity, low cost, online storage that is still manipulatable by Veeam. So how it's achieved is actually through the use of the scale out backup repository object within Veeam. So you'll notice here on the left side, you may have your traditional backup targets, whether it's direct attached, NAS attached, or a dedupe appliance for writing your backups to. And on the right side, we've got those object store capable destinations, whether it's an S3 compatible on-prem appliance, whether it's Amazon, or even Microsoft Azure Blob storage. So the scale out repository adds the ability to have an archive tier where you can move the data automatically from those on-prem, more expensive data repositories to the object-based repositories. Key to making the archive work as you would expect is the fact that Veeam actually keeps some of the data on-prem so that we can actually deal with and catalog and work and manipulate with your backups just as if they were on a traditional repository. So we have a little bit of a shell of the actual state of the backup, but the bulk of the object itself is actually stored up in the object store. This means it's a familiar interface. You work with object store data just like you work with any other type of backup repository data within the Veeam environment.
One of the key things, sorry to interrupt, but one of the key
Sure.
things to, for those that are familiar with how the cloud services work on ingress and egress charges, knowing that egress costs more than ingress. When we do restores from these files that are out in these object stores, we're only pulling back the blocks that are needed. We're not pulling back that entire large VBK file. So we're being as efficient as possible in what's being pulled back so that the number one, it doesn't take as long to restore, and number two, it's not costing you more than it needs to pull that data back.
Excellent point, Eric. Thanks. So really with the use of the object stores, you can really say you now have infinite storage for your backups. You can continue to use the same familiar functionality that you've got with Veeam. And here even it says as far as even instant VM recoveries from those object stores. We have those self-contained backup files that are forever incrementals. And there's, most importantly, no per terabyte licensing fee for an archive tier. So if you look at some of the competitors out in the marketplace today, as you move things outside to an object store, they're still charging you to keep track of that data based on the number of terabytes that you're moving outside. So big differentiators. And today, the supported archive tier extents, we talked about this just a second ago, but Azure Blob Storage, Amazon S3 and S3 infrequent access. And then there's some on-prem S3 compatible solutions that have been tested. And Eric helped me out here, but I believe, basically as long as it's S3 compatible, we should be able to write to it. This is just the list that we've tested as of now, correct?
Absolutely right. And this list is probably even dated at this point. There could be even more that have been officially tested, but as long as it's using, S3 model, it should work.
Yep. Great. All right. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Eric for a little while here, and he'll pick up with some direct restore to AWS.
Great, thank you. So for direct restore to AWS, we have the ability now to do something that this was just a little more complicated to do than the feature that we already had, which was to restore to Microsoft Azure. So we have two ways that we can restore these VMs. We can do a native import via S3, so it could pull directly in from those from that scale out backup repository that we were talking about that's using the cloud storage, or we can do it using an on-demand helper appliance. The need for the helper appliance is the need to do the conversion from the existing model, which would be either a VMware, excuse me, VM, or a Hyper-V, or a physical server. The AWS still uses the BIOS model as opposed to the UEFI model. So there is a conversion that has to happen that makes the helper appliance beneficial to get things converted in a timely fashion. You can go ahead and click.
Yep.
Great. So as you can see, we have the ability to restore. If you can back it up using Veeam, we can restore it into EC2 now. So anything that's backed up using Veeam backup and replication, which would be your virtual machines from Hyper-V or VMware, using the Veeam agent for Windows or Linux. So that covers your physicals, including your desktop models. So it could be a workstation or it could be a server. And Veeam availability for AWS, which is our product from our company N2WS, which is backing up VMs that are already in EC2. So we have the ability to restore from those backups as well into EC2. So what this gives us is a much more fluid model of where you want your servers and your data to exist. So it could be, you could take something easily from on-prem to cloud, from one cloud to another cloud, from physical to virtual to cloud. The flexibility is now there for you to choose where you need to work from, and it can all be accomplished within Veeam itself. You can go ahead and click.
Yep.
So we've done some improvements on the agents and the management of the products as well. So new with the management, we have the ability to do, this is an important one, file level recovery for two failover clusters. Before the ability within clusters was a little limited. This was one that I think is more quietly more popular than we think, and that's the rebooting the host option. Is now only shown during installs when the reboot's actually needed. In the past, you didn't know if you tried the product to see if you really needed to reboot or not after you did an install. Now, if it says reboot, it means it. The uninstall option removes the installer service, so we've done a better job of cleaning up after ourselves as we're working through. Excuse me. You can update configuration licenses without the periodic rescans. And again, the theme that we've seen through all this, full PowerShell support for agent management functionality. And I think that that's a very important thing as enterprises begin to use the products more and more. They need the ability to script across multiple locations and multiple platforms in order to manage things centrally. Next slide. So for the Veeam agent for Windows, the biggest things that we, excuse me, have had come along for the updated version are the support for multiple jobs on standalone systems. So it's not only that before you either had the ability that the local user could do a backup and manage it locally from the workstation, or it could be centrally managed through the Veeam console. Now we have the ability that that local user could manage a backup, say if they wanted to back up to a local hard drive, and also you have the ability as the manager of the entire backup system to run backups that would go back to a managed repository. So that gives you the flexibility of the user being able to do quick restores, and you also being able to make sure that you have a company copy of the data as well. Backup and restore removable USB drives. This is hard drives, not thumb drives, but it gives the ability now to capture anything that would be attached to a computer out in the field that you would need to get backups of. The ability to check the health of those backup files as they're done, and the addition of Windows Server Core Edition for managed jobs. For Linux, we've added BTRFS support, so we're supporting additional file systems. Application-aware processing for Oracle as a managed job, so that means it would have to be going back into the main Veeam systems. Active full backup options, snapshotless backup options if the snapshot driver can't be installed. So it would have to be for, if an NFS mount, which doesn't support a snapshot, was being used, you have the ability to do snapshotless backups on these Linux systems now. So Veeam Data Lab Staged and Secure Restores is, the Staged and Secure Restores are two new features of a feature that's already existed for a long time within Veeam Backup and Recovery that a lot of people don't know about or just haven't implemented. Data Labs used to be called Virtual Labs, but we've rebranded it as Data Labs because we are looking at expanding the use of it beyond just testing for backups. What we're looking to do is test the data, but not only that, be able to use it as a dev test sandbox and a patch testing area. So there's more features that are available for it. If you want more information on Data Labs, we can certainly provide that later, but I'm going to focus on the two new features today. So staged restore is quite honestly a direct response to GDPR. My apologies. The ability to stop a backup before it is released back into production and to be able to inject a script so that you can remove data before it goes back into the wild. So using the example that's here, this customer is interested in buying a house in October 2017, so they register in the construction company database. The database is backed up daily. And let's say that then in December or January, that user asks to have their information removed from the database and from all of the company information, which is his right. So an issue happens, let's say a month later, and in order to restore that database, they need to go back to, let's say, a December database backup. Well, John Smith's information is still in there. So if you just restored that back into production and kept doing business as usual, you're now not in compliance with the right to be forgotten GDPR rules. So what needs to happen prior to that is you need to do something to remove that data. So using staged restore, we have the ability to bring that database online in an isolated environment. The company can run scripts against the database to remove that data, and they already have those scripts. If they're already needing to be in compliance with this, they have those scripts that they're probably running constantly anyway. They just need to make sure that they run them to come up to current requirements as far as who's requested to be removed from it prior to releasing that database back to production. All the scripts are run, confirm that the data has been removed, and then that VM can be moved back to production. So it gives you that ability to do all that testing prior to releasing the database back into production. And then for Secure Restore gives you the ability to scan a server or a volume prior to release back into production for viruses, malware, ransomware. For an example for this, if you think about it, typically when things like ransomware or malware that has timers in it, the time between when that actually infiltrates your network and it's executed is about 140 days on average right now. So if you think about that, if you're doing, and day zero patches for those are not necessarily something that's out there. So if you need to get a backup from, let's say you have to restore files from 6 months ago. 6 months ago, your files could have been infected, but you may not have known it until 5 months ago. So what you have now is the benefit of, prior to releasing that VM out of a quarantine environment into production, you have the ability to scan old data with current virus definitions. So what happens is you select where you need to restore from. Let's say it's from 6 months ago. You mount those restored disks to a backup server, and your antivirus runs against those mounted disks. If no issues are found, you can restore it right back into production. If an infection is found, you can restore it without network so that you could either scan it or pick out files you need. So perhaps the files that you need aren't the ones that are infected. So you could go and in an isolated environment, pull out just the individual files you need. Or if you want to be the safest you can abort the restore altogether and say, you know what, it's not a viable restore. I can't pull it from here. So you have the ability to do that scan again prior to it hitting production and relying on your production antivirus systems from doing that. So the engines that we are compatible with, which are on the next slide, I believe. Maybe I'm wrong. No. So the engines that we're compatible with today are Symantec ESET, Windows Defender, and we work with anything that has a command line. So we can directly plug in with the Symantec, with the Windows, and then if it has a command line, it can be scripted so that we can run against it as well. And just about every major provider has a command line option that you could run against. So it pretty much means we can work with the entire gamut of enterprise and corporate level antivirus platforms.
All right. So thanks, Eric. I'll take over again for a minute here. I'm just going to take a real quick minute to talk about some of the new enterprise application plugins that came along with Update 4. So two of the big plugins here are support for Oracle RMAN and SAP HANA. I'm not sure customers on the webinar today if you're using this or not, but if you are, these were big things to include in this release. The ability to have the visibility to those enterprise apps from Veeam is critical for customers. From the RMAN perspective, this also allows the Oracle DBA to continue to use the tools he's familiar with, but give the Veeam backup administrator visibility into that. Not going to spend a lot of time on these guys. Again, if there's particular questions or use cases, please do follow up with us and we can do more in depth with you. Just wanted to let you know that they're there. Another feature that was added, sort of a request or almost a missing feature for a little while, is NDMP support. So, for those of you that were out there using NAS devices where you couldn't install an agent before, we can now grab those via NDMP. So, very much like when tape support was added, people were saying, well, this was a missing feature. We do now have NDMP support. It's a little limited. It has to be NDMP version 4, and you're doing entire backups and restores of the volume. And then there are some restrictions for some incremental restores and no file level restore at the moment, but at least we do have the capability to grab data off those filers today. Additionally, if you are a tape customer, there were some tape enhancements that came in Update 4, support for worm media, some new media sets, and then some new logic for the grandfather, father, son tape backup rotation. Again, if you want to dig into these a little bit deeper, we can go offline, but just wanted to mention that these things were here. And turn it back over to Eric for one final topic.
Instance licensing. So we've decided with Update 4 that it was time to look at our licensing model and give it a refresh. And the reason around that is, if you look at what we've done with the product, and I was mentioning it earlier, it's much more fluid where your workloads can start from and end up. So you can be on-prem, you can go to the cloud. Well, our licensing model didn't allow for that as easily as the product was allowing for it. So it was time to make a change. So many of you are probably on our perpetual or socket-based licensing. That's not going to change. That's always going to exist. But there are certain workloads that are not going to work with that. And you may have seen those already anyway, which is the physical workstation licenses, agents. If you have cloud workloads, you're going to start to see that it's tougher to tell which license you need. So it replaces our current subscription model with a more portable licensing model. So instead of buying a specific product, you're buying an instance and then applying it to what you need to apply it to. It's available in all three of our product models, available in standard enterprise, enterprise plus, so all the additions. Include Veeam 1 or not include Veeam 1. And as a general rule of thumb, one instance equals one VM. There is a calculator available out on our website, and that gives the ability to find out roughly what you have how much it's going to not only cost you, but how many instances you're going to need. So it takes the difficult math out of your hands and allows us to help you do that. So I kind of already explained a little bit about why we went to the instance licensing. We really needed to make it so that you're not worrying about what kind of license you need. And we didn't want to frustrate our customers with, workload specific licenses where if you're changing the way you work and possibly changing on a regular basis, you may have to throw away licenses while buying others. And that doesn't really work for our customers and to keep them satisfied. So we've simplified the way you order. We've simplified the way that you apply those licenses. All told, I believe the number was we reduced by about 58% the number of SKUs that we have in our product line today. So I would say that that's an improvement and a simplification. If you have any questions on how to apply those licenses, we can certainly help you at Veeam. And again, the folks at IntegraONE can absolutely help with that as well.
All right, and with that, I think we're gonna wrap up and we'll open it up to the floor for questions. Again, if you do have any questions, go ahead and type them in. We'll keep the past couple minutes here for answering some questions as those come in. Well, I'm waiting for some of those just as a reminder. Again, for those that are eligible, when we wrap up here today, you will get a short survey. Fill out that survey, send it back, and you will receive a $10 Starbucks gift card. And for those that unfortunately aren't eligible because of the E-rate requirements, again, please do fill out the survey anyway. It does help us for feedback and for future event planning. So, just looking to see, I don't see any questions coming in at the moment. So Eric, I guess you and I have done a really good job.
Wonderful.
And again, we got about a minute left here to the end of our time this morning. But if anything does come up, do feel free to reach out to us. We'll definitely get back to you from there. With that, I think I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar this morning. And thank you again for all your time. And Eric, thanks for the presentation.
And thank you for having me.
All right, everyone, have a great rest of your week.